This is your Chargers linebacker, Deion Henley, and you're tuning in with Chargers Unleashed.
Welcome to another edition of Chargers Unleashed. Jake Hefner here with you from the LA Football Network. Today's show, of course, is being brought to you by Underdog Football, Fantasy, AG1, or a Mint Mobile and Rock Solid Sports Memorabilia. If this is your first time tuning into the show, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Dan Wolkenstein is currently in transit right now as he was actually at the game for the Chargers against the Green Bay Packers. We tried to actually do this show earlier. Unfortunately, internet issues prevented us from doing that. So Dan and I put our heads together and said, screw it. The emotions are high enough as it is right now that we needed to do a live show. Obviously, the X's and O's from yesterday's game are probably most likely going to take a back seat given the mental state of the fan base today. So obviously, a lot to discuss. A lot of emotions that need to be vetted out. We're going to get to all your comments in this in the chat room here, and let's just break it down. The state of the Chargers as it currently stands right now, 11 weeks into the season, Chargers currently sit with a 4-6 record, and the remaining opponents that they have left on the slate are all AFC conference opponents. I said it yesterday when they dropped the loss to the Green Bay Packers that there's a good chance that those playoff hopes went with them, falling to 4-6. And as the whole narrative, as everything around this team is going right now, it is really hard to put into words that this team, given who's at quarterback, given the talent that is on both sides of the football, that they can currently be sitting with the record that they are at right now. 5 losses, all by one score or less this season. It's been tough for Chargers fans to stomach. And obviously, the big story has been today, Brandon Staley. Brandon Staley tries to stay as cool, calm, collective as he can with post-game press conferences. And all of us have probably seen it to this point in terms of talking about what needs to be done. He has not been shy about accepting a responsibility for what's been taking place. But yesterday reached a bowling point for him as he was asked about yet again, as he was originally asked last week in terms of play calling responsibilities after that Detroit Lions game and then giving up over 500 yards of offense. Brandon Staley was first asked about if he was still going to be handling the defensive calling responsibilities, to which he said yes. And of course, after this game in Green Bay, he was asked that question yet again. And apparently that was one too many times for Brandon Staley to hear, as he had emphatically said, I am going to be continuing to call this defense. Do not ask me that question again. You don't need to ask that question again. And Dan and I have talked about this plenty of times on this show, that the issues for the Chargers at this point of the season, we're not talking about one game. We're not talking about 3 games here. We're talking about 11 weeks into the season, 10 games that this team has played together. Since the jump, defensively, the Chargers as a whole, as it stands today, rank 31st in EPA. Bottom of the barrel as it relates to pass defense, giving up the most yardage of any defense through the air. And that has been an issue for them, giving up those explosive plays since week 1. And I'll get into this just in talking about in terms of response and things that you see from other teams and try to use examples from that standpoint. But when it becomes that big of a problem, even stemming from the 27-point debacle that you had against the Jacksonville Jaguars and blowing that game, and you wrap that up as a macro to where we currently stand right now, these questions are valid. They really are valid. because we all expected at some point something to change, some adjustments to be made. And I get it. We're talking coaching, we're talking player execution, which you go back and you watch that Packer game, there was definitely some things that were not executed well. And complementary football, which has just been a foreign language to this Chargers team for seemingly 10 weeks now. But when it's this big of a problem and things continue to get worse, not better, there's cause for these type of questions. So obviously I want to I'm sure what the chat room is feeling right now is probably what I expected in terms of where everybody's emotions are at currently sitting with this team. Want to take your guys' questions and continue to kind of dive into this a little bit in terms of where the Chargers currently stand, what the 2023 season may have left. I don't know. The chances are very, very slim to none at this standpoint. What it's going to look like for the remainder, what is possibly going to change thereafter. And even if you look forward to 2024, it actually, as it stands right now, it's not even that optimistic with the Chargers current salary cap situation. So want to take some questions here in the chat before we get into the rest of this. GS saying, do we even win another game? Honest question. Honestly, and if you've listened to me for as long as I've been doing this show with Dan, obviously Dan's more of the optimist between us. I usually err on the side of caution just because we've unfortunately been viewers to this movie for years and years and years and years now. And judging off of what we've seen, hell, beyond Brandon Staley, even during the Anthony Lynn days, even during the Mike McCoy days, even during the Norv Turner days, it's always something, right? It's always something. So I don't know. Baltimore, here's the thing, and I'm not talking about this just in terms of Baltimore. It's always the Chargers will back themselves into a corner like this, and when they're completely written off, it was kind of the similar mindset that people had as they were going into that game against Miami last year. When they're completely written off and their backs are against the wall and everything is coming at them, they somehow pull out a win that nobody saw coming, that they really shouldn't have win, that stats don't support. And now you're going up against one of the better teams in the AFC with the Baltimore Ravens, with the defense they have, with the way that their offense is working. I don't see any way for them to do that. New England, regardless of what you want to say about them offensively, Bill Belichick knows how to coach against the Chargers. So I wouldn't even guarantee a possibility of that being a surefire win. You still have 2 divisional games left to play against the Denver Broncos, who right now are playing winning football. That was a team that started 1-5. They have now rattled off 4 straight. You still have Kansas City. You still have the Raiders left to play. You still have Buffalo in that schedule. I don't know. Do they probably go winless in these final games? No, I probably don't see that. But I can't pinpoint right now any one that I would say, even if it's the Raiders or the Broncos, usually that's a team that the Chargers have recent history shows that they have split with, go 1-1. It's just hard to tell with this team right now, especially defensively. What team is going to show up? You just don't know. Matthew Dahl, this is Herbert's 4th season as a Chargers, and he has no playoff wins. Burrow, Mahomes, Lawrence, Allen, and Lamar, enough is enough. We can't have a Rivers 2.0. Look, I totally get it as far as where Justin Herbert currently stands in his career right now. The other quarterbacks that are in that upper echelon of the NFL have progressed and made it further in this circumstance than he has. I get that. Talent-wise, you just can't waste any more time with this. You just can't. And it is infuriating when you see especially these past 2 weeks, Justin Herbert play the way that he has. Even in Detroit, he didn't even get off to the best start, but he willed that team to come back and tie that game multiple times. And unfortunately, the defense was the Achilles heel. You look at it this week, defense, once again, they got more stops than they did in that Detroit game, that's for sure. But when it really counted, when Justin Herbert was able to take that team back down and give them the lead. The defense was unable to show up. And you throw in the drops yesterday, and you can even go back to prior performances. Uh, the Minnesota game, which the Chargers ended up winning, that was another stellar Justin Herbert performance. Obviously, it looks like that finger is no longer debilitating him. I personally think that these last 2 weeks that Justin Herbert has performed has been his best of the entire season. Even though the stats may not tell the entirety of the story, I think that he has been locked in. He's been emotional. He's been accurate. His anticipation has been better. He's finally being mobile outside the pocket again. And that's the type of Justin Herbert that you're going to need. Unfortunately, football is a team sport. The last time that we all checked, it is not. It is not an individual sport. And Justin Herbert and Keenan Allen damn sure can't do this alone. But it's going to be tough. And I don't know what the rest of 2023 is going to hold for this team. It's going to seem like a long road until we get to the offseason, that's for sure. But the next chapter for Justin Herbert obviously is going to take place next year. And you would hope that regardless of changes, coaching, GM, whatever it is, it's at least going to put him and this team in the best situation to succeed. Let me see. Let me just go through a few more of these other ones here. Joseph DiMartini, playoff hopes are done. No chance we win Sunday versus the Ravens. We have yet to prove we can beat a good team. Not wrong. Not wrong. Against the 4 contending teams that are currently in the playoffs or vying for the playoff spots right now, you can make an argument for the Minnesota one, but when the Chargers beat them, they were 1-3 and they weren't even being talked about in the playoffs at that point in time. But if you isolate Miami, Detroit, Kansas City, Dallas, we've been waiting for that one game for them to come out and show that they could actually beat a quality opponent. It hasn't happened yet. And then, of course, dropping the game to a 3-6, now 4-6 Green Bay Packers team. It's just hard to fathom where this team is going to go for the remainder of this year. Dennis Yum, no player in that locker room respects Staley, just throwing offense under the bus, claiming his defense is not an issue. His defense last 3 years ranked 32nd for 3 years. Not necessarily 32nd, but definitely the bottom rungs of the defense, not where you'd want to be. And this is where, of course, everybody's comments are about Brandon Staley as it currently stands right now. Brandon Staley was brought in here because of his defensive prowess, what he did with the Rams, having Aaron Donald, Jalen Ramsey, and what he did in that year as a defensive coordinator. You have invested so much money in this defense as a franchise. And yet, with the talent that you have, whether it's a combination of player execution, poor coaching schemes, self-inflicted mistakes, you can't get around the fact that the explosive plays are something that's still been happening for this team now 2 years in a row. Last year was the run. This year's the pass. The Chargers currently, right now, are 31st in EPA in terms of yardage allowed. They're last in the league in yardage allowed through the air. 50% conversion rate on third down. And since Brandon Staley took the reins over on this team, they give up 20% of the time, 27% of the time when it is a 3rd and 11 situation dating back to 2021. Those numbers are not acceptable. They're just not acceptable. And Dan and I talk about this a lot when we talk about trends and things that we see and trying not to jump to any conclusions until it becomes a trend. But this is a trend that has been with Brandon Staley since he has been the head coach of this team. And unfortunately for Justin Herbert, it has hurt him either chances of getting to the playoffs when he ultimately made the playoffs. And as it stands right now, a very slim chance to make the playoffs until something changes. And I wanted to get into this a little bit just in talk of coaches that you've seen and teams that you have seen make adjustments. Let's go in the AFC West, for example. Let's look at the Denver Broncos. 1-5. Everybody was writing them off, saying that the Sean Payton, Russell Wilson connection does not exist. It's not there. This is a bad football team. They gave up a 70-burger to the Miami Dolphins. People were saying that they were headed historically to the worst statistical year for a defense ever. And what have they done since then? They have rattled off 4 straight wins yesterday against the Minnesota Vikings in a comeback victory. At Buffalo, they defeated the Buffalo Bills, turning that ball over 3 times. And they gave Patrick Mahomes the worst performance that he has ever put out there as a quarterback since he has been in the league. That's turning it around. And now that team currently sits at 5-5 and is actually in playoff contention. Let's go to another team. How about the Cleveland Browns? Cleveland Browns, who have been searching for some good quarterback play the entirety of the year, just lost their franchise in Deshaun Watson, had to trot out DTR yesterday, and still found a way to get a win. That team's backbone and how they win games is all predicated off their run game and their defense. They know who they are. They know who they are to where the standpoint, if they could even get mediocre play out of their quarterback, that's going to be enough to win the game. How about the Pittsburgh Steelers? Pittsburgh Steelers, who just from an offensive standpoint seem so inept, yet they have a winning record. Mike Tomlin, who has never, ever had a losing record since being a head coach of that team, somehow or another, you're able to find ways to win games. Minnesota Vikings. When the Chargers beat them, they were 1-3. Nobody was talking about them for the playoffs. They lose their franchise quarterback in Christian Kirk. You bring in Joshua Dobbs, who was playing for a different team just a few weeks ago. And even now, sitting where they're at, they just had a 5-game winning streak come to an end, but they now put themselves back in playoff contention for the NFC. There are ways to figure out and make adjustments at a certain point. You figure this out. 11 weeks into the season for this Chargers team still having these issues, I don't expect the switch to flip at this point of the year. It's like that old saying, when someone shows you who they are, you believe them. And based off of everything that we see, this is what the Chargers defense has been. And until they show otherwise, and I'm not just talking about one game, until they show otherwise for a good period of time, this is who they are. And as I've talked about narratives, what is there to lead us to believe that anything is going to be different? Let's get into a few more of these questions here. Hearing a lot of narratives via the GM, owner, and coach. Do you have any idea on who has made some of these decisions? Like QJ, I heard the scouts didn't want him. Coaching hire, GM, or owner. Look, Quentin Johnston had a bad day yesterday. He has been obviously forced to accelerate his career and his adaptability to this offense because of injuries to Mike Williams, Joshua Palmer. When the Chargers drafted him, there was no expectation for him to come in and be the number 1 wide receiver right off the gate. You knew that still belonged to Keenan Allen. You still knew who your number 1 and your number 2 were going to be. But at this point in time, you've been without Mike Williams for long enough. We know Joshua Palmer is on short-term IR. He's got a couple weeks till his return. And these were issues stemming back to Quentin Johnston from college. And I don't want to go so far as to hammer Quentin Johnston for yesterday. Did he have a chance to obviously help win that game? 100%. He took responsibility. That is a ball that any wide receiver should catch. And unfortunately, we haven't seen the development of where we thought that Quentin Johnston was going to be. Now, that is for a variety of different reasons. He and Justin Herbert are still getting chemistry and him getting infused in the offense, but a ball like that, you just had to have. And nobody feels worse about that than Quentin Johnston right now. Believe me, you could see that as soon as he was walking back to the huddle, and it's just unfortunate. So the only thing you can hope for as it stands right now, I don't think that people should be labeling him as a bust just yet. It's too early for that, playing only half a season as a wide receiver. But at this point in time, with what was needed from him, it is disappointing. As far as the standpoints of GM, owner, or coach, as far as what that decision was, look, prototypical wide receivers that the Chargers like and Tom Telesco, that was there. That's what Quentin Johnston possessed. These issues with Quentin Johnston go back to his time at TCU. Eventually, you would hope that these issues with these drops go away. At this time, it's premature. I understand the frustration about it, but nobody is beating themselves up right now more than Quentin Johnston. Unfortunately, our Bolts miss Zay Flowers, Jordan Addison, and Tank Dell. If Dan was here right now and he read this, he would probably go off on his own tirade. He was probably the biggest Tank Dell fan of anybody as it relates to our communication, and good reason for it, because we obviously see how he's performing right now. Zay Flowers was a personal favorite of mine, just given his electric capabilities and what he could bring from a speed standpoint. Look, like I said, it's too premature as it stands right now to label Quentin Johnston a bust for a variety of different reasons. Never seen a wide receiver be afraid to catch and so soft for a guy that is that big. He can get off press, and he is not a national hand catcher. I hope he gets coached up in being around Keenan. Honestly, I agree with the last part. And personally, I think that he will. And this was kind of the question that went into one of Brandon Staley's questions from yesterday. Is Brandon Staley retorted back to, I believe it was Daniel Popper that asked the question. You were there out at training camp. You saw what he was doing. Dan and I were out there at training camp as well. We saw those catches being made by Quentin Johnston. That was one reason that it was being publicized so much, because of the standpoint of the issues that he had in college. And as the media is coming out about him, you're seeing him make these acrobatic catches. It's trying to push that narrative, down the line to say like, oh, this guy really does have good hands. Guess those college reports must have been wrong. And while he was out there, aside from the ones that were actually broadcast, Quentin Johnston looked great. He really did in training camp. But it does become a different animal when you're in there against opposing defenses. And I would hope and I would believe that somebody like Keenan Allen, the leader of this team, is taking Quentin Johnston under his wing. And everything that we have heard about Quentin Johnston in terms of his affinity to learn and absorb information that he's been doing since training camp, it's going to get better for him. It should get better for him. But the drop issue is something that needs to go away sooner than later. I mean, obviously, Puka-Nacua, I think, surprised a lot of people for what he's done with the Rams this season. Marvin, do they even use Marvin Mims in Denver? I don't know. I don't know. Trust me, I've made a couple of bets with him on Underdog Fantasy, and he hasn't really gotten that much target. So, not denying what he did in college, but in terms of what he's done thus far in the NFL, I'm not so sure. Let's transition to more of this Brandon Staley narrative here. For anybody that is calling for the removal of Brandon Staley as it stands right now, I understand why. You hear it all over mainstream media right now. I get it. I understand the reasons why. As far as the Spanos and doing business, you're probably not going to see it. They will not remove a head coach mid-season, even if it means something that is detrimental possibly to the team. Who knows? Do I think that they could take a chance and have Kellen Moore be the interim? See what you got? Sure, that's a possibility. I just don't see it happening based on the way that this organization takes place. And for anybody that's asking for it, I feel your emotions. I truly do. I feel your emotions today. And it makes sense. And I get it. We've all collectively been frustrated with this product, things not changing. But I personally don't think that is going to take place prior to the season. We'll see where this Chargers team ends up at the end of 2023. Now, do I think that the odds are favorable in terms of Brandon Staley returning to 2024? Unfortunately, I don't. As it stands today, no. And I think Dan and I said this, or we talked about it when he was brought back after the Jacksonville playoff loss. I personally felt like that was with a condition from the front office, from Spanos, from Telesco, and everybody else to say, we're going to bring you back. We're going to retool some things on the coordinator side. We're going to try to get this offense going, be more productive. We're going to try to give Justin Herbert more weapons, but we need to get back to the playoffs and we need to make a run in the playoffs. And if that doesn't happen, then you can fill in the blank. I just don't see, even if the Chargers were to go off on, let's just say, a 5-game winning streak, I don't see them making the playoffs. I just don't see them pulling that rabbit out of this hat this year. And I don't see, with all of this noise that is there from the narrative that has been created by the product that we see out on the field, that you could collectively bring him back this year. I just don't know. I just don't see how that could possibly be a logical option. Let's get into some of these here. People don't understand that Staley gets paid either way unless he is willing to forfeit his contract. We all know he's getting paid, so Spanos family isn't going to pay for nothing. That's one perspective of looking at it. Just in general, you look at Staley, Anthony Lynn, Mike McCoy, Norv Turner. Was all the same. Well, Justin Herbert, Keenan Allen, Khalil Mack rescue the Chargers stuck on iceberg these last 7 games, or where the both ships sink to the bottom of the Atlantic. It doesn't look good right now. It doesn't look good, especially with Joey Bosa now being put on short-term IR. At least that's what was said today from Brandon Staley's press conference. They said it was a foot sprain that he injured. You could see how visibly upset Joey was when he got on the cart. That's 2 weeks in a row now that you have taken an injury shot to your edge position. Last week, it was Chris Rump that got hurt in pregame warmups. This week, you lose Joey Bosa, it felt like, within the first 5 minutes of the game. I don't know. First of all, Justin Herbert and Keenan Allen cannot do that by themselves. I'll tell you that much. What I will say, to kind of turn this into a positive spin, if you want to take what you've seen these last 2 games from what Justin Herbert has done and what Kellen Moore has collectively called offensively, I really like what I've seen from that standpoint. I like the play calls that Kellen Moore has been calling to get his tight ends involved in between the 20s, not just in the red zone. I like the idea of getting Austin Eckler out in space, regardless of even how he's performed, because we know that running game has seemingly been non-existent. I like the standpoint of how they have moved Keenan Allen around to a spot on this field that he can be used to his full potential and not just be a slot receiver. He is having an absolutely monster year. So I like some of the plays, or I like the game plans that Kellen Moore has called a lot over these past 2 years. And when you have Justin Herbert executing it the way that he has these past 2 weeks, you can beat a lot of teams that way. Defensively, you can't say the same story. Jeremy Fowler reported maybe about 20 minutes before we came on the show here from a comment of Brandon Staley, basically saying that in regards to the questions on defense, that there was going to be some adjustments in the secondary. Don't really know what you have to work with there. I don't see you making any adjustments between Derwin James and Alohi Gilman. At corner, Sante Samuel Jr., Mike Davis, Jasir Taylor. How many more pieces do you really have to move around? Nor do I see this as them going out and picking somebody up. I don't see that as a type of adjustment. Maybe infusing Dean Leonard into a little bit more of this defensive secondary. You elevate a Sang Bassi. I don't know. you don't really have that many options to work with, which is why that quote perplexed me a little bit. I'm really not sure where you expect to go defensively. And like I said, we're 11 weeks into the season now. And we have been having these problems on defense seemingly since week 1. And we have seen the same type of issue. So I'm not really sure at this point what you could say could be an easy tweak, retool, personnel change that's going to all of a sudden infuse a big change into this pass defense. Let's see this one here. We need to brace for Tom Telesco not getting fired. I don't see him getting canned. Tom Telesco, and again, I don't particularly like talking about the fate of certain coaches or GMs. It's pretty much, I would hope that it could be talked about subtle enough to where you know where it's leaning to say it doesn't look good. It's definitely on the hot seat as it relates to Tom Telesco. I said this back before the season started. I personally believe that Tom Telesco and Brandon Staley's fates are linked. It would be hard pressed for me to think, even though I think that Tom Telesco has a better chance of staying than Brandon Staley does. But with this front office now, you look at the head coaches that have been under North Turner, Mike McCoy, Anthony Lynn, and now Brandon Staley. And with the minuscule playoff performances that you have been able to put up, even when you have ended up making those playoffs, obviously each of those head coaches ended up making the playoffs once, didn't have the results that you ultimately would have wanted. And it has been rough sailing in between those years. It would be hard pressed for me to believe that Brandon Staley and Tom Telesco are not linked. I really do. And depending on how this whole thing shakes out, we'll see. Let me transition into this talking about now the 2024 season. Whatever the Chargers record is by the time that we get there. I'm going to go on a hypothetical here and not talk about head coaching changes because we could talk about that for a long time and talk in terms of talking about potential replacements. There is a list of people that if it came to that a lot of people, I'm sure, would be clamoring for. But I'm going to talk about strictly the team as it relates to the 2024 season. There is a good chance, and I don't want to sound all doom and gloom when I say this, but if you start looking at the tea leaves for everything that is on the Chargers' plate financially for them in 2024, it's going to be difficult to get out of the minus column in terms of the cap situation that you're going to be in. You have some difficult decisions that are going to be on the table between Keenan Allen's contract, Mike Williams' contract, Joey Bosa's contract, Khalil Mack's contract. You have some guys that you're ultimately going to have to sign next year and make a decision on whether or not you are going to do that. Kenneth Murray being one of them. You know you're not going to have Austin Eckler on this team. Corey Linsley, obviously, with his heart situation, it does not sound like he's going to be returning. You're going to have some expiring contracts on the defensive line next year. There is a number of spots that this team is going to need to address, and some of them are not going to be hard to swallow because some of these teams, for financial reasons alone, you're not going to be able to bring back. And oh my goodness, wouldn't you know it, look who has joined the show. Dan Wolkenstein. Dan Wolkenstein has reception.
A little bit. We'll see how long this lasts.
Dan
Jake
Wolkenstein
Hefner
coming on to save me.
I don't know about that.
The shows do not feel the same without you, sir. That is for sure. I'm not sure if you happen to hear what I was talking about, but I was talking about going into the 2024 season, just talking about this team personnel-wise and what the Chargers are going to basically be up against with hard decisions that they're going to have to be making, cap situation, players that are going to have to be unfortunately let go just to even fill the number of holes that you're going to have, players that you know you're not going to have on this team. I was basically summarizing that up to say there could be a good shot that 2024 may end up being a rebuilding season for the Chargers.
Well, Jake Hefner, on brand. Yes, we're talking about the draft and free agency and 2024 cap situation already. I mean, look, we talked about that since the year started, that there's a lot of decisions to be made. You know, we obviously know about the Keenan versus Mike discussion. We know the Khalil Mack versus Joey Bosa. We know there's some other guys. It's Corey Linsley. We don't know what's going on there. John Everett's going to be a free agent. Austin Johnson, Sebastian Joseph Day are discussions to be had. Mike Davis is a free agent. Like, there's so many question marks. And that is because the Chargers had this 2-year window of going, quote unquote, all in. And that has equated to 1 playoff berth and currently 4-6 record. Given how things have gone, the only name that feels quote unquote safe, in my opinion, is Keenan Allen. Seeing what he's done in 11th year, already eclipsing 1,000 yards, insane. And he seems to be Justin's security blanket, even when Mike Williams is healthy, even when Josh Palmer is healthy. I know he's a bit older, but I think that they try and restructure and kind of get him in. Ideally, if it was my guess, I would guess that they would rather have Mike and Keenan than either of those 2 pass rushers, in my opinion. You saw what they got in Thule. They can go back in the draft one more time. And in theory, they could substitute $60+ million at the edge position with 2 draft picks. But to make a long answer short, the cap situation sucks. And Ed McGuire is going to have to pull out some rabbits out of his hat again. No way about it. I mean, simple as that.
Deanna, obviously, you coming on the show, and I touched on it a little bit, but I wanted you to actually really get into your feelings as it currently stands right now, obviously with these back-to-back losses the way that they've had, the issues that you and I have talked about ad nauseum as it stands right now with this Chargers team. The floor is yours on this one as it relates to Brandon Staley, the coaching staff, and the consistent problems that this team has just not been able to put it all together for 11 weeks into the season.
Yeah, and I apologize. I wasn't able to attend earlier. We had bad reception, and then if you can't tell, I'm literally on a train somewhere between Chicago and Texas. That's as far as I know. So apologies if I repeat anything that you had said. But yeah, these last 2 weeks, and honestly, the last month, if we're kind of going back to the back-to-back losses, followed by back-to-back wins against teams that maybe, the Jets possibly were a good team, at the time, at least on defense. But to see what has happened against the Lions and then against the Packers and how we have made those 2 teams look, it's been a struggle. And I think a lot of Chargers fans right now are still processing. And, I think the first step is acceptance, and then you're pissed, and then you're sad, and then you're trying to figure out solutions. But the last 2 weeks have just been brutal. To lose the way they did in Detroit, which we talked about. And then I was at Lambeau. I saw that firsthand, how the entire team and coaching staff, in many ways, kind of let Justin down throughout the entire game, whether it was drop passes by Donald Parham, Keenan Allen dropping touchdowns, Quentin Johnson dropping a dime that would have been at least a game-tying field position, 3rd and 20 defense giving up penalties again, guys slipping, Austin Eckler fumbling. It was, that game was a microcosm of like what can go wrong does go wrong oftentimes with his team. And Jake, you and I were talking earlier. I think the thing that is most frustrating about this is you try to find a solution, right? And maybe that is Brandon Staley no longer being the coach. And I'll talk about that in a second. But you can't peg this on one half of football, on one quarter, one player, one coach, one issue. Like, it is several issues. It is both sides of the ball. It is both halves of football. It is early in the season. It's late in the season. And it flip-flops. And they can never be anything but inconsistent. And so, yeah, Laus de Bruin, you nailed it. I think Chargers fans, in short, are tired of seeing opposing quarterbacks having quote-unquote career days against this defense. Jordan Love having a career day against this defense. You saw what Kirk Cousins did. You saw what Tua did.
Ryan Tannehill had his best game that he had had in almost a decade.
Travis Kelce had like a $160.5. Like, you're seeing it over and over again. Now, sure, you could say, but look at the Chicago game and look at the Jets game and look at how they were able to kind of come back and win that game in Minnesota. But Jake, 5 losses, all by 3 points or less. 0-5 this season. And it boils down to the lack of consistency. They cannot execute. They're sloppy. They have not been able to make adjustments or shift or improve on those all season. And a head coach that either refuses to acknowledge or at least accept or try to improve the issues that are desperately screwing this team out of losses. And, you know, I was thinking about this earlier. I know this is a bit of a tirade, and I apologize for going long, but, you know, you can't a coach, right? A coach can't tackle. A coach can't, you know, get in field position. A coach can't turn his head around for interception. A coach can't be on the field to make sure that they don't get a long penalty. A coach doesn't throw. A coach doesn't block, right? A coach doesn't run. But a coach is supposed to have a staff in place that instills those qualities from its players and his team. And if/when those things don't happen, it's the coaches and the staff's responsibility to adjust and make it happen. If at some point, if they A, don't accept or attempt to adjust, B, the players then, if they do adjust, still aren't fixing the issues through 11 weeks, then how can someone say that the coach is doing his job? It's not saying he's a bad coach, but I think he might not be the right coach for this team. And so far this season, sure, could they go on a crazy winning streak and make all of us look silly? But Jake likes to say it. What have they shown this year specifically, that is possible or even likely? I don't know what is the solution to this year. I don't know what this team's identity is. I don't know what this team is good at. I don't know what they can depend on. I don't know who is calling the shots or the plays, other than the fact that Brandon Staley says he's calling the defensive plays. I don't know who is or is not making adjustments. It just seems like the team is just waffling. And it's a game like what we saw yesterday in Lambeau, where you're seeing a Packers offense go crazy. You're seeing runs of 50 plus. You're seeing passes of 50 plus. You're seeing Jordan Love hitting wide open guys. And you're seeing your Chargers offense look worse than the Packers offense. Now, sure, some of that is because of drops and fumbles and miscues, but like, that's the story of this team. So I get the frustration, and the unfortunate part is it's only going to get harder. Now they got a Baltimore team. Like 4-7 is looking very possible and probably probable. Then what? I've said from day one, Jake, I've said when the Chargers team are eliminated from the playoffs and or do not make the divisional round, that will be the day that Brandon Staley is let go. I've said it since the offseason, since February. They've already got 6 losses. Jake, you've said that you think that you have to go 10-7. I've said 9-8 could possibly get in, which means in my best case scenario, they got 2 more losses to go. What are the chances that happens? I think I saw like 12% chance or something like that they make the playoffs.
Sounds about right.
It's like, yeah, it's doom and gloom. It's dire. I know I said a lot there, but I don't know how much of that was repeated.
Oh,
is there anything there that I said that you disagree with?
And that's part of the problem. That's, again, why this narrative has been created. That's why these questions are being asked to Brandon Staley in this press conference. Dan, I'm not sure if you caught this, but close to when we were about to go on the show, Jeremy Fowler had written that in terms of Brandon Staley had made some comments in terms of changes that were going to be happening in the defensive backfield after recent struggles. Brandon Staley said, I think it's fair to say that there is going to be a lot of competition in the secondary.
But
isn't that like a response that you get after 3 or 4 weeks of the season?
Well, 1, yes. 2, who's walking through the door?
That's my point. Does this mean you're going to go out and sign some free agent? Okay.
In week 12?
Who's on the market? What are you going to rotate in your secondary enough as it stands right now? There's nobody better on your team to play free safety or at the safety position besides Alohi Gilman and Derwin James. So there shouldn't be any changes happening there. What are you going to rotate between Jasir Taylor, Asante Samuel Jr., and Mike Davis? You have Dean Letter on this team. You have Asang Bassi on this team. What's the plan here?
And anyone who comes in, are you really going to have that much faith? Are you going to be like, oh, that's going to be the knight in shining armor? Like, and why would you think that someone externally is going to fix this? Because they're going to get slotted into the same fundamental issues. It's frustrating. And I think I have been a quote-unquote supporter of Brandon Staley. I think he's a smart individual. I think he understands scheme. I think he implores a lot out of his players. But unfortunately, the players can't keep up, or at least haven't shown that they can consistently stick with the game plan. And to hear the comments yesterday, and I'm going to paraphrase it, I don't have it in front of me, but essentially, I believe in this defense. I believe in my scheme. I believe in my coaching. I believe in the skill sets of the team. To me, when I was listening to that, I'm like, there's no way that he could be talking about their performance. Maybe he's talking about their potential. Maybe. But I would love to be able to ask Brandon Staley, like, what has this team shown on the field consistently, is the key word, that enables him to believe that. But at the end of the day, if Brandon Staley is unwilling to acknowledge some of the issues that are obviously plaguing this team, schematically, situationally, I don't know how he stays with his team. It just falls on deaf ears. And it's unfortunate. It's heartbreaking for us covering this team. This is now year 5, year 4. It just seems like this entire team has just gotten bogged down in mud and nobody's pulling them out. Justin Herbert is literally trying to do this on his own, blasting guys in the chest with a football, and they're dropping it. He's slamming the ball on the ground because the center isn't able to snap it in time. He's running for his life, and he's the leading rusher and passer on this team. I was going to say he'd probably be the leading catcher too if he could, but other than Justin Herbert, who hasn't been perfect, but he has been far from anywhere near the main issue on this team, and I guess you could probably put Keenan in that, although he had a bad few drops. Who on this team has been consistent?
It's a short list. Dan, we've seen the disconnect kind of show up throughout this season. Obviously, most recently with Brandon Staley's comments yesterday. And then you hear comments from Alohi Gilman in the locker room after that game, not being necessarily specific, but him saying that changes need to be made, not necessarily alluding to what, but you can read between the tea leaves however you want to try to interpret that. We heard comments from Jasir Taylor after the Detroit loss, how it talked about how when they have things that are wrong on defense, their process in terms of how they go in to try to fix it. You heard it after the Kansas City game in terms of that zone defense that we saw so much that Travis Kelce was just made to roam free. And I think it was Derwin and it was Mike Davis that in the locker room had said, we played a lot of zone defense. And then you heard Brandon Staley on the podium say, no, we didn't play a lot of zone defense today. It was contradicting terms between player and coach. And what I've said there's two things at play here. It's either the coaching is not working, or there is a disconnect between player and coach, and that product is not coming together on the field. Both fall on the shoulder of the head coach, and both situations are bad. So only one can really be true here for the scenario. And again, it's a lose-lose either way. But one thing is true, and it's got to be either one of those at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's perplexing, and at this point, Brandon Staley's like doubled, quadrupled, quintuplet, whatever the phrase is, down on himself and his ability to coach and lead this team. And I don't know how this season is saved, barring some complete 180 in the areas that they struggle most in. I just don't see how it happens. The main issues that have cost this team victories have been lack of execution, specifically in the most opportune times, lack of consistency, and lack of complementary football. I don't know what the silver bullet is that's going to fix that. The explosive plays are still happening on defense. The offense still is not necessarily performing the way it could be. Evident you scored, 20 points against the Packers? At some point, you are what you are.
That was that was the first time that the Packers have this season have scored more than that.
How many times do Chargers fans have to hear? And for the first time in NFL history, blank happened against the Chargers team. Like, we enable history to be made way too often. And I say we. They enable history to be made way too often. And if you can't acknowledge and if you can't realize that, like, I don't know what to say. So I do have to run here in a few minutes, but I feel for Chargers fans. I feel for those who are desperate for a victory, who's just gutted and infuriated by how the season has gone. And it seems as though, like, the Darwin effect, whatever the phrase is, like what can go wrong does go wrong. That's been the case. It could be injury. It could be all of the things we mentioned before. And all of it ends up being different each week. And that's what makes it so tough. And, like, I don't know what the solution is, even with a coaching change. Like, look at the coaches that are there in season for the Chargers to swap out. You got Derek Ansley, who I don't know how much of an impact he is on this defense right now, but he's a defensive coordinator. And whatever he's doing with the secondary, which, by the way, he was the one that was managing the secondary previously, I don't know how that will fix it. I don't know, but that optic doesn't look great. Offensive coordinator Kellen Moore, a lot of issues on the offense too. Running game is non-existent other than Justin Herbert and a very mediocre running game otherwise. Kellen Moore, I don't necessarily know if he's like the leader of men type. He seems pretty quiet to me. He seems pretty reserved. quirky, not in a bad way, but that's pretty uncommon for a head coach. Maybe you go special teams Ryan Ficken. He manages the side of the ball, at least a third of the ball that seems to have been the most consistently successful. But then you got a special teams guy managing the team. I don't know what he knows about anything other than that. Chris Beatty, maybe wide receiver coach. Like, we're grasping here. So I think Brandon Staley is frustrated. Like, he's fed up with how the team's performing. I don't think he's done a good enough job. And I don't think him not acknowledging, I mean, he's acknowledged it. Like, he said it's on him. The team needs to improve. But, like, dude, we're two-thirds of the season.
We've heard this before. We've heard these same comments almost recycled like a broken record. Like, you could just put a record player up on the podium and play that, and it would be the same quotes that we have heard when it comes to this team losing games. When is something supposed to change? Week 12 of the season? I have a hard time believing that.
It's a struggle, and Kelsey said it. Like, Derwin looks nothing like he did previous years. Joey Bosa, we've seen glimpses of it, but I don't know what he is right now. Khalil Mack's had a pretty darn good year. I mean, I know 6 sacks in one game kind of helped the cause, but he looked pretty good. Mike Davis going downward now. Aside Samuel Jr., I think he's up and down. Keenan Allen's balling. Justin's balling, sure. But, like, I just... There's blame to go around everywhere with everyone in every game. And, like, at some point, that is an indictment on the coach. Like, if there is no stability, if there is no consistency, if there is no thing to hang your hat on other than just give the ball to 10 and cross your fingers, what is it we're doing? So I'm curious to see how this week plays out. I'm curious to see what happens in the upcoming press conferences if the team continues to lose. Like, things are escalating. But I will say, Jake, this is the last thing before I head out. You know, yesterday, infuriated, right? I think everybody was pissed. But I've kind of said all along, like, if there's some sort of peace and, like, there's something tranquil about the finality of this season. Like, you and I talked about, like, no matter what, only one of 2 scenarios will happen. Either it goes positively and all Chargers fans are loving Fourth and Staley and embracing the success and we're off to the AFC Championship game or whatever, something like that. Or the Chargers, lose the first round of playoffs, don't make the playoffs, and complete and wholesale changes occur. And there's something sort of, like I said, like cathartic, I don't know, but in the finality of that, like, at least we know it's going to go one way or another. And so I think being able to brace for that and being able to kind of live in that, I think has kind of helped me a little bit. Doesn't make the season any less painful, but knowing that real change will happen. It might not be as quickly as people would like, i.e., a couple weeks ago or this week or next week, but 2024 will be different. I promise you. And there's something calming about that.
Are you trying to, I'm assuming you're just being very subtle in your reasons of thinking about that, or is this being ultra optimistic with your thought process for 2024?
I think this is me being accepting of the finality of it, honestly. My daughter thinks the same thing, by the way. Like, it's, we started the season, like, it's going to go one way or the other. And there is no gray area this season, like we saw last year. This is black and white. And right now...
I don't know why I'm black and white right now, honestly.
I was going to say, right now, so is Jake.
I don't know what type of technical difficulties I'm having right now.
Yep. All right, well, I have to run because I'm about to lose service. I don't know where we are. Look, we're literally in the middle of... I don't know if you can see it, but we're somewhere... Oh, we're in St. Louis, Missouri currently. So I got to run. My phone's actually about to die too, but thank you for dealing with all of my technical difficulties, Jake. You're the man. apologies for all of it. But Chargers fans, we'll get through this together. We always do. Take it away, Jake.
Will do, Dan. Thanks for tuning in, buddy. We'll talk to you soon.
All right.
I'm going to wrap this up on one thing here. And guys, you can fire off as many questions as you want to. I'll try to get to them as quick as I can in my final words here. First of all, I'm very proud of Dan for the way he is already thinking about 2024. Trust me, I am in that bank as well for what we normally cover during the offseason. But as it relates to this Chargers team, as it relates to the facets of the front office, as it relates to the head coach, everything that we've been talking about on this show, 12 weeks into the season, you basically are what your record says you are. And as Dan and I had said after the Detroit Lions game, what this Chargers team is, unfortunately, because we both wish that we could be talking about this team in a more positive light, unfortunately, what they have shown us is that they are good enough to contend with any team in this league. But the problem is, and the biggest problem that has plagued the Chargers for many years is that they're always the ones that lose the close games. Hence the 0-5 in games decided by the one score. Those type of games do not translate to playoff worthy potential teams. And 12 weeks into the season, you need to either figure out how to win or you don't. And obviously, for biggest reasons as far as why the Chargers are where they currently sit at 4-6, hasn't always been because of the defense, but a large majority of that you could point to because those are the areas where the biggest negative trends have plagued this team. How they even fathom to turn it around, try to turn it around, I don't know. But you got games to go, starting with Baltimore. And like Dan, and I'm sure like many of you, the outlook for that game is not pretty, considering what we've seen. Beyond that, New England, Kansas City, Denver twice, Raiders and Buffalo, it just does not look good for this team ending up on any type of playoff hopes for the 2023 season. For what is to come, time will tell on that as it relates to who is leading that team. But in terms of, as Dan was saying, something is going to look different in 2024. Don't know what it is yet, but we'll see what takes place. As far as the players, I think everybody who can read between the lines knows, as pissed off as this fan base has been, those players in that locker room don't enjoy a 4-6 record, especially in the ways that they have lost games. I would bet every dollar I know that there is a lot of responsibility being taken in that locker room personally, even if you were to exclude the head coach just from if you had a players meeting, those type of questions. And it's tough. It's tough for them to accept the fact that they have not been able to put complementary football together 12 weeks into the season. I don't know what foot they end up on here. It's probably not going to be a good one by the time all things are said and done in 2023. Beyond that, with player contracts that you have, big decisions that are looming, the team is going to look different in 2024. Whatever this team can possibly salvage out of this last stretch of the season, let's hope it's at least something positive. Appreciate you guys tuning in. We'll see what these next weeks have in store. Dan and I will always be here. We love bringing you guys on for live shows and talking to all of you. And we appreciate all the comments. You guys are a great fan base. We love reporting on this team for you guys. We'll talk soon. Thanks so much for tuning in to Chargers Unleashed. We will see you next time.